Well, here we are again. Welcome back to Mount Vernon. My name is Doug Bradburn. I'm the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and it's been my delight to have these live opportunities to talk about our mission here and about the story of George Washington. As you know, last Wednesday, we were in our museum. This is what we call our education center here at Mount Vernon. It focuses on the life of George Washington, really a grand sense of his biography and why he matters, and how he impacted the age that he lives in, and why his legacy still matters to us today. Last time we were looking at his youth, a youth that you'll remember we said is oftentimes wrapped in romance, it's wrapped in myth. It's hard to get at because it's the period where it's the least documented, but it really is an interesting period to understand George Washington in the context of the 18th century. But of course, he's most known to Americans and perhaps to folks around the world as a great military commander, the general who led the Americans through the American War for Independence, through 8 long years of war. And his identity as a warrior is a crucial one when we think about who was George Washington, how did he think of himself in his time, and why does it matter today? Now, George Washington as a military commander is still studied regularly in the great military disciplines in this country at West Point, the Naval Academy, as well as the War College, because Washington is a fundamental figure in the establishment of an American tradition of leadership in arms. He was the first officer of the American Army. The United States Army dates its own birth to his service. And the Continental Congress's appointment of him to taking over the Army, which we'll talk about a little bit. And so that story is important to thinking about the cultures and traditions that are part of American military power and military leadership today. George Washington also, though, was a man of the 18th century. You know, he lived in a very different world with different assumptions about how warfare should be conducted and what was needed. And some of that, I hope, will come out as well. You know, what was different about the way an 18th century officer might organize troops versus today as well. So let's get into it. I want to start really at where I left off last week, which is the French and Indian War. So George Washington's military education was through the process of fighting in the French and Indian War. He had no experience when he was leading men into battle. He had no experience organizing men or creating a camp or building a supply train or any of that. And so he learned a lot of the basics in the field through long service in the French and Indian War, and also by many mistakes. You know, he had a skirmish that turned into a nasty assassination, as the French consider it. And then he lost one of his early commands at the Battle of Fort Necessity, where in the French and Indian War, he had the Virginia Regiment and some other troops surrounded by British with no Native American allies, and ultimately had to surrender his post in that moment. But yet he survived to go on to great things in the French and Indian War, and he would go on to become known as a very respected officer and a respected colonial officer, particularly by Virginians, but also by colonials throughout North America. In part, this had to do with his exploits at the Battle of the Monongahela, the what's often called Braddock's defeat. General Edward Braddock, the great British, well, he wasn't great. In fact, he was a fairly inexperienced but long-serving British commander who was sent to attack Fort Duquesne in 1755. And George Washington served as a volunteer on his staff. At this point, Washington had resigned his commission in the Virginia Regiment. But Braddock, in asking around for informed locals, Braddock, in fact, had his great war meeting with a number of royal governors in Alexandria, in Carlisle House, Alexandria. John Carlisle was related to George Washington through marriages. So Washington's brother, you'll remember, married into the Fairfax family. John Carlisle was also married to a daughter of William Fairfax. And so George Washington was very much on the radar of people in Alexandria when Braddock was looking for some expertise, and he agreed to volunteer, and Braddock agreed to have him. And it served Braddock's army ultimately because George Washington was able to help lead the retreat after Braddock's army was caught by an ambush of well-prepared Native Americans and some of their French allies, which is mostly a Native American victory, and one of the worst defeats in British history. Braddock's whole army is decimated, really, and Washington is able to help guide this retreat through chaos, only a few miles away from the forks of the Ohio River, which was their goal. And George Washington, after that, comes back and finds Virginia in a position where it's completely undefended. One of the things that Braddock's army did when they marched out west is they built a big road. They carved out a road, an army road, to make it easier for Braddock to bring his army out there. But once they were defeated, essentially that road became a highway for Native Americans to come rushing back into the Virginia frontier and spread out and assault the Virginian settlers in the Shenandoah Valley. And so without any protection, the colony of Virginia begged George Washington to come back into service to become the head of the Virginia Regiment again. And he ultimately, reluctantly, did come back in to be the colonel of the Virginia Regiment with a new plan, essentially a strategic plan that was intended to just defend the frontier. And Virginians had a series of forts. And Washington found himself in an incredibly challenging position for the next few years, which was a defensive one where he only had about 1,000 men, sometimes upwards. He's supposed to have about 2,000 men, but it never really was that many, across multiple forts in the Shenandoah Valley, intended to cover 400 miles, essentially, of frontier. And of course, Native Americans aren't stupid. They're not just going to attack the forts where the troops are. They go around those and they attack the settlements, and they would carry away captives and they would steal goods and basically make civilian life miserable and dangerous on that frontier and keep the whole colony on edge. And Washington was in a very difficult position of having to defend this frontier. But one of the things he did learn throughout that period was how to command men, how to train men, how to fight in what at that time was called the Indian style in the woods, using light infantry tactics, learning how to track Native American groups, and obviously learning a lot about supply and morale and motivation. In fact, some of the early essences of George Washington, the leader, we see developing in this period. So, for instance, there's an episode at one of the forts that Washington's in charge of, where he had been away for a while and comes back, and there had been drunken carousing by some of the officers at this fort, and Washington has to go through the process of court-martial, where the officers will convene and they will try the other officers for misbehavior, and he has to exercise punishment. And after that, he writes an address to the Virginia Regiment, officers of the Virginia Regiment, which basically says that it takes more than the title to make the officer, and that it will make it his duty to serve with the utmost respect to the rules of comportment and training, but he will also expect that of the others as well. And he also said that he will punish with severity, but at the same time, he looks forward to rewarding the merit of the best, the brave, and the most meritorious. And that notion of it takes more than the office, more than the title to make an officer, and that he was going to reward merit but punish poor behavior, was a key to understanding Washington's sense of what leadership means in that environment. And he puts an emphasis on training and on reading. And in fact, he lists a number of books that officers should read. And you're going to see this throughout his own experience as a military leader. The importance of training, the importance of reading. So the other thing about the French and Indian War I do want to bring up before we get into the American Revolutionary War more generally is that George Washington really becomes alienated from the British world for the first time during his experience in the French and Indian War. He trained the Virginia Regiment over these 3 long years of bloody campaigns, as he called them, and made them into a very highly regarded professional regiment. They aren't a militia unit. They are an established military unit at the colony-wide, at the province-wide level, but they aren't what's called the regular British establishment. So they're not part of the British Army per se. They're provincial regiment. And so what that means is George Washington's commission as a colonel is not effective when he's around an officer who has a king's commission. A king's commissioned at the level of captain is supposed to be able to have authority over provincial colonels, which of course to George Washington is seen as a huge insult, an insult to his rank and his honor. And so there's constant concern that these provincials are going to end up serving alongside regular troops, and then all their officers would be degraded in the face of these British regulars. And so Washington was trying to get his own commission and, in fact, his whole regiment put on a British establishment recognition, which would equalize his own status within the British Army more generally, the British imperial forces collectively, but would also do the same for all of his fellow officers. He had about 60 to 70 officers in the Virginia regiment. Now, this comes to a head a couple of times, throughout the course of the French and Indian War, and he fails to get this recognition, although it becomes quite close. But he thinks the great opportunity has emerged with the appointment of a new British commander-in-chief at about 1756 or 7, which is the Earl of Loudon. John Campbell, the Earl of Loudon, is made the new commander-in-chief of all the British forces in North America. And John Campbell is a Scotsman. He's also a nobleman. He's the Earl of Loudon. And he's appointed commander-in-chief, but he's also appointed the Royal Governor of Virginia, which is really important because the Royal Governor of Virginia obviously represents the throne, the crown in the Virginia colony. Now, Virginia is mostly run by what are called lieutenant governors. So we have a royal governor in Virginia, and then he appoints a lieutenant governor. And that lieutenant governor actually goes and lives in Williamsburg and runs the colony on behalf of the actual governor, who most of the time is an absentee governor. He stays in Scotland or he stays in England collecting his salary for being the royal governor, but not actually doing anything. In this case, all of a sudden, the royal governor of Virginia, the real royal governor, the big cheese, is coming to the colonies. Also, he's also the commander-in-chief of all the forces. So here's George Washington thinking, well, this is perfect for me because I am the colonel of the Virginia regiment. So I have that connection to this royal governor. Plus, I'm, obviously serving in this war. So I have that connection to the commander-in-chief. Plus, I've got all this experience in fighting in this war. And he has an idea, a strategic idea that he wants to bring to his superiors. He wants to go on the offensive. He can't defend the frontier of Virginia over 400 miles with 2,000 men, but he knows that if they could take the forks of the Ohio, where the French have built Fort Duquesne at this point, that Fort Duquesne is really the launching point of Native American raids really from everywhere southward and into Pennsylvania from the forks of Ohio, because it's a place where Native Americans are coming actually from Canada and from further west and from all over, coming down to Fort Duquesne, getting supplied and being able to then launch raids into the frontier of Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, and even further south. And so if you could take Fort Duquesne, you can cut off that whole region's ability to sustain native warfare on the frontier. Washington knows this. Fort Duquesne is the hive that they have to destroy. And he knows that the only way to really stop the raiding then is to take over that fort, seize the forks of the Ohio. So he wants to go on a mission. He wants to convince the new commander-in-chief, Lord Loudon, to make this assault on the Ohio. And so what does he do? He takes he writes a very flattering letter to Lord Loudon. He names his new fort after Loudon, Fort Loudon. He writes a flattering letter about, the greatest of generals and the greatest of men. We're so delighted you're now in charge. I look forward to my chance to meeting you. He actually goes to Philadelphia, where Loudon is, and tries to set up a meeting. And Loudon, of course, he's the commander-in-chief of the British Army. This is like some random colonel trying to talk to the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff with an idea about what they should be doing. That typically is not the way that these sorts of decisions are made. And so Washington is put on ice. And here he is cooling his jets for 2 weeks in Philadelphia, trying to get the attention of Lord Loudon. He's finally allowed in to see him. And what does Loudon do? Loudon not only says, I have no interest in hearing your ideas, young man. Washington's only 24 at the time. Remember, with from Loudon's point of view, very little experience in arms, and he's a provincial to begin with, which means he doesn't know anything about warfare from the perspective of a European. But not only that, Washington, not only are they not going to go in the offensive, but Washington's Virginia Blues, this regiment that he's trained over these years that he's so proud of, he's going to have to lose some of his men, and those are going to be sent to South Carolina. And so Washington emerges from this meeting completely humiliated and angry, and writes what I call the smoking gun letter that he writes to the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, who he's been working with for years, and complains to Dinwiddie. He says, I cannot conceive that Americans, only because they're not British, will be denied the rights of British subjects. It's essentially saying, how come we aren't treated equally with the British? And he goes on to point out that there's no other regiment in His Majesty's service that has served 3 bloody campaigns without recognition. And that idea that Americans are lesser than the British comes through very powerfully in an angry way. And I think this is the crucial moment. If anyone was to ask, why does George Washington ultimately become a rebel against the king who had served in the French and Indian War? This experience with Lord Loudon is one of those moments you can point to and say, there's poor George Washington being treated like a dog, and he's never going to forget it. And so ultimately, of course, the French and Indian War, Washington does participate in one other thing about Loudon, I'll say, which I like, to give you a sense of the character of John Campbell, the Earl of Loudon. Benjamin Franklin, who was in Philadelphia at the time, said of Lord Loudon that he's like St. George on the tavern sign, always on horseback but never going anywhere. So you get the sense of this man, who played at being a great soldier but never really did much, and in fact he didn't. Ultimately, George Washington does get to participate in a successful march on Fort Duquesne. He goes with the Forbes campaign, 1758. In that campaign, he believes he has a major impact on helping to lay out the line of march, because he has experience with this sort of wood fighting. He also, although doesn't get what he wanted from Forbes, which is he wanted Forbes to take the same route that Braddock did, what's called the Virginia route. But Forbes took a longer but flatter route through Pennsylvania, and ultimately had the same success. The French left the fort before the British arrived, so they arrived in an empty fort, were able to secure it, and that success basically ended the French and Indian War in the South. I mean, it was correct. Once you took Duquesne, the French had no way to project power basically south of the Great Lakes in any kind of force. So when that was over, George Washington resigned his commission. It was clear that his ambition in military was not going to be in the British Army, and resigns his commission, marries Martha Washington, and embarks on his next career as a Virginia planter. And so it's really interesting to see that as connected, that he is turning his back on a military career that has been denied him, essentially, as his interpretation, through the idiocy of the British. And now he's really going to become that Virginia planter that he never had been. And to do that, he brings Martha Washington to Mount Vernon, and the next phase of his life begins. Okay, so let's go fast forward into the American Revolutionary War. And why don't I take a question as a way to get into it, as a way to think about George Washington as a soldier in the American Revolution.
Sure, Doug. So Watcher would like to know, Washington was one of history's greatest generals. Who were his mentors, and how did he learn strategy and war tactics?
Question is about Washington, considering the fact that he is one of the greatest generals, certainly in American history, and I will submit that he is, and we can argue about that and why we have to think of him in that way. So who were his mentors in arms? How did he learn? So a couple of interesting things here. George Washington obviously learned by doing here. And one of the incredible things you see about him is that he will fail. or he will blunder and make mistakes, but he clearly learns from his experiences in the French and Indian War and also in the American Revolution, as we'll talk about as well. But he was also a great reader of all the military books of the age. He clearly learned a lot from Braddock and the officers that surrounded Braddock, including people like Thomas Gage, who we later will face off against in the Boston theater. But also, he read all the latest treatises. He particularly started focusing on what was sort of petite war tracks, light infantry, a guerrilla war, we might call it today, that was emerging in some of the literature of the 18th century. But, in the 18th century, the European mind of warfare was fairly stuck in a tendency that had basically existed for almost 100 years. The technology hadn't really changed much. I mean, the British were using a musket that was basically like the musket that they were using in 1705, or that Marlborough was using, in the wars around the 1710s. The Brown Bess musket, which the British used, and these were, you would mass firepower in groups of ranks of infantry, and the goal was to outmaneuver, outnumber the other team's infantry on the other side, and it was very static in the way that they were thinking about tactics and the approach to warfighting at the time. So Washington is learning from this European tradition through their manuals, which emphasized drill, which emphasized lines of men with muskets, who would march close together and shoot basically at point blank range until the other side were weakened, and then they would be charged by the bayonet. This was how European battles had been fought for almost 100 years. After the evolution of the bayonet onto the musket, which got rid of pikemen, essentially. And cavalry was used in minimal ways as well in these major 18th century European battles. So Washington could learn about that tendency of warfare, but he also learned, I think, from the ancients as well. Interestingly, he read Julius Caesar when he was during the French and Indian War, and Caesar, the commentaries on Gaul, which Washington was reading while he was actually defending the British frontier. Caesar is defending the Roman frontier, and Caesar's talking about the challenges of defeating an enemy. In this case, the German tribes, that fought in a different way than the Romans had been fighting. And so, in a sense, Washington is learning from these treatises and tracts. The great military figures in the 18th century world. You have the ancients like Fabius, who was able to defeat Hannibal. You've got Caesar. You've got the moderns, Gustavus Adolphus in the 30 Years' War. You've got Maurice of Nassau. You have William of Orange. You have Eugene of the Savoy. Prince Eugene. You've got Frederick the Great. In Washington's time, Frederick the Great is the living greatest general of the age, and Frederick the Great is the epitome of what the highest level of what tactics had approached by the middle of the 18th century. The Prussian army that Frederick controlled, heavy infantry that were very well trained, would bring firepower to bear. Emphasis on highly trained, expensive, permanent armies that you would not use very often, and hopefully many of them wouldn't die because they were so expensive to train and maintain over the period. And so 18th century warfare tended to be focused on siege craft, and Europe was dotted with fortresses and castles that controlled all the different rivers. And so fortresses are really, when you think about strategic battles and fighting in Europe, they're thinking about seizing rivers and fortresses because these armies move extremely slowly. Their supply lines can only be a couple of days away at most. They require a tremendous amount of fodder and food and horses. In fact, one military historian described 18th century armies as they're shackled by their supply lines. So imagine a giant man walking with shackles on. These armies move very slowly, and in fact, most battles that we think about in the 18th century are great sieges. rather than big set pieces. You're going to see a major change in this in the 19th century with Napoleon. But the American Revolution is really fought as probably it's odd that you have this Revolutionary War that's fought at a time of really these older sensibilities about what warfare looked like in the 18th century. So Washington is schooled up in that tradition through reading, through certainly these generals he served in the French and Indian War, but then also, as we'll see, through the American Revolution, he evolves in his own thinking and understands how to command at a high level. The real challenge that he's going to face in the American Revolution is he's never commanded anything more than 2,000 men. That's a brigade level. That's tiny compared to being the commander in chief of an army. And even though he often doesn't have that many men directly under him, we'll see, like in the New York theater at the fight over New York at the very beginning of the war, when Washington commands about 25,000 men, he spread across different areas. He makes some fundamental mistakes about how to arrange that army, which probably has as much to do with his own inexperience in command at that level as anything else. How about another question?
Sure. MJ wants to know, what kind of reputation did Washington have among the soldiers versus at home?
The question is a reputation of Washington amongst the soldiers versus sort of beyond the soldiery. There's also kind of an implicit question there. What was his reputation like, to the enemy and to the other side? And this aspect of his reputation is really important to recognize. He was ultimately beloved by the soldiers. In fact, a lot of his political power within the army, the fact that he never lost his command, had to do with the fact that there was a huge core of not only everyday soldiers, but also the officer corps that loved Washington and believed that he could do no wrong. And this came through experience of working with him. He was, as a leader, very much a great listener, welcoming other points of view, promoting men of great talent. He had a great eye for talent. When it came to the regular soldiers, he was there. He stayed with the army in a way that generals in the 18th century did not do. So he's at Valley Forge in the winter. He's at Morristown through 2 brutal winters. He's there with the troops. He never takes a furlough. He spends every day with the army, and even those 3 days that he comes to Mount Vernon, he's coming to Mount Vernon to prepare for the arrival of the army. He's not going on a vacation. So, they say that 90% of doing a job is showing up. Washington showed up, and that has an impact. And the other thing he did when he was there, he wasn't like the kind of general, he wasn't an Omar Bradley, he wasn't a soldier's general. He's not going around, shaking hands and trying to be one of the guys. But he's doing what's expected of him. So, he's not trying to go into people's tents and sort of be one of the guys in the middle of their adversity. He's doing what he's trying to find them food. He's trying to find them clothing. He's writing letters. He's getting the local authorities mobilized to support the foraging of this army. So, he's actively seen as trying to make life better for the army. And he's not the one they blame when they don't have shoes or clothes or gunpowder or guns. They blame the Continental Congress. They blame their states. They blame the politicians who clearly, are either corrupt or incompetent. But here's Washington doing his damnedest to make sure we got what we need. So Washington is very popular amongst the soldiers, and much of that spreads into the American people as well. There's a reason he's the most trusted man in America by the end of the war. It isn't just the soldiers, it's the stories they tell about him when they go home. Because these soldiers don't serve for the most of the war. They serve for short periods, and then they go back to being a farmer. The stories of George Washington are spread by word of mouth. In fact, it's likely that everybody knew somebody who could claim to have served with George Washington, or whose father had, or brother or uncle or cousin had served or seen him or talked about seeing him. It's really a remarkable thing. I do want to mention his reputation amongst his opponents. The British made some critical mistakes at the very beginning of the American Revolutionary War by underestimating the Americans. And when I say the Americans, I mean all the Patriot Army, the idea that colonials could ever fight. I mean, it is in 1775. Even Thomas Gage, who's married to an American and has served in America his whole career, will basically say of New Englanders, they'll be bold in council, but they won't show any stomach in battle. They don't have the guts to do it. They like to talk a lot, but they really don't know how to fight, and they're not going to be able to stick this thing out. They extend that for too long, thinking about the Americans in that way, really have no respect at all for their ability as soldiers. And part of this is there's good reason for that, because the European army has to train infantry for 2 to 5 years before they can be expected to stand in a line, taking fire, changing fire, and then winning a set-piece battle. The colonials have never been able to do that. They've never done that. And they don't have bayonets on their rifles, and, they might snipe at officers from trees, but that's no way to win a battle. And so the British have good reason, to think that they have the advantage. But what they didn't bargain for was the fact that the Americans had tremendous leadership in George Washington that was flexible, that it was able to train up troops that had other resources that they could draw on that the British would struggle with. And ultimately, George Washington is seen in Europe as one of the greatest captains of the age, one of the great generals in world history. So particularly after he turns the tide of battle at the end of 1776 by crossing the Delaware in those 10 days in which he not only crosses the Delaware, defeats the Hessians, he maneuvers around a larger army, wins the Battle of Princeton, and forces, because of the way he sets up his troops afterward, he forces the British to lose all of New Jersey. It's considered by Frederick the Great, the greatest military figure in Europe, as some of the finest 10 days of generalship that he has ever seen in history. And so in all the courts in Europe, the name of George Washington all of a sudden becomes this reputation of great generalship to be studied and to be admired, probably in fairly romantic terms. But that attitude spreads also amongst the British generalship over time, that Washington is not just some American bungler, that he's actually a very challenging foe to bring to fight and to defeat, certainly in any kind of definitive way. This is a great question.
So Doug, Giddy would like to know, how often did Washington get home to his wife during the war years?
Well, Washington didn't get home to Mount Vernon really at all during the war years, as I mentioned. But in fact, home often came to him. George Washington had a very close enslaved man, William Lee, his enslaved valet, who served with him throughout the war. This is someone Washington knew, obviously, from his world at Mount Vernon, had been his personal manservant. They'd been in the hunts together in Virginia, and now they were together in war. So that familiarity was certainly part of Washington's day-to-day life in the camp. But also Martha Washington, obviously, she came to him every year during the war. She came through great hardship, across terrible roads, through danger, put herself in danger to come to the winter camps and bring supplies. She also mobilized women's support for the war, making cartridges, making clothing, raising money, and really was a crucial part of Washington's experience of the war during the winter time, when all he had was cares and stress. Could he make this army survive another winter? Could he make sure they're training so they could be alert and active when the winter ended and the British, who he often had to react to, were going to go on their campaign? And Martha was there to calm his mood and make him into really a better man and a better leader. In fact, the officers in Washington's experience would often celebrate when Martha arrived in camp, because it would make him a little easier to deal with, a little less angry, a little less wound up, because he tended to be a control freak and trying to have his hand in everything. And I think Martha, leavened his personality quite a bit. That's a good question. What do we got?
Norman would like to know, I heard that it was Hugh Mercer's idea to cross the Delaware to surprise the Hessians. Any truth to that?
Question is about Hugh Mercer, whether it was his idea to cross the Delaware. There's actually a lot of different people who can claim it to be their idea, including George Washington himself. So let's set the stage a little bit. So what's happening here is George Washington, in probably his only major strategic blunder of the whole war, is in the New York theater. So the British are sending an expeditionary force to destroy this rebellion. And George Washington is set up, under the guidance of Charles Lee, one of the commanders that he puts in place of the defense of New York. George Washington is in command of about 25,000 troops in Manhattan and on Long Island. And what he does, and it's incredibly strategically important for a lot of reasons. The Hudson River is crucial because you can't let the British control the Hudson. New York is a very important port. It is dominated by a lot of loyalists, so it's important to sort of keep control of that area. The Continental Congress wants George Washington to defend New York. And so Washington is there. Now, it's also untenable, as we know from hindsight. New York is an island, and it's surrounded by navigable waterways for hundreds of miles. And George Washington has no navy. So an amphibious assault can outflank anyone on New York at any time, particularly given the ability of the American army at that time to move rapidly and effectively. And so George Washington stations all of his troops on either Manhattan and Long Island. So it's a huge strategic blunder because General Howe, who commands the invasion, could simply have landed on Manhattan Island and outflanked George Washington and destroyed the whole army. And it's hard to see how Washington could have escaped, if at all. But fortunately, Howe was not that enterprising of a commander, and so he fought him first on Long Island and then fought him on Manhattan Island, and allowed Washington to ultimately escape destruction. And in fact, it's a series of losses. Obviously, in Long Island, the Battle of Long Island, Washington loses, but he does have a successful retreat, and they don't ultimately lose the core of their army. He loses a series of battles in Manhattan and skirmishes, although they do hold ground at crucial moments in that fight. And Washington's going to learn a lot in these losses. He's going to learn the value of maneuver, because he sets up in Manhattan in numerous strong positions, and Howe just outflanks him every time. So the value of maneuver. He also he understands the value of training. His troops cannot move effectively on the battlefield. He needs to train them to function as a proper infantry unit that can move without becoming chaotic, that can move and fight, that can not only hold ground and entrench, but can fight effectively on a battlefield without losing sense of order and panicking. And he also learns the value of naval power in that battle of Manhattan. So these are three crucial things that he's going to need to ultimately triumph in the Revolutionary War, that he's allowed to learn in these series of losses in this blunder. All right, so let's get to the main point, though. So his army ultimately, does escape from Manhattan, although he loses 3,000 men at Fort Washington. And that loss is really the big loss, because now Howe actually has something to claim victory about, because seizing New York, which is a town of 20,000 people, we think of New York City as this incredible metropolis. New York City is a port in North America. It's not in charge of anything outside of its immediate hinterland. It's an important place and a valuable place. But in European eyes, for Howe to say, I fought all these battles and I've won this, port of New York. I mean, it's not exactly a great victory without capturing a big chunk of George Washington's army, which he was able to do at Fort Washington. So it's a huge blow to morale, to the cause, and a great celebration for British arms in that campaign. So Washington is escaping from Howe through New Jersey, retreating back towards Philadelphia and being chased by the British across New Jersey, and his army is disappearing. Men are leaving, their enlistments are coming up at the end of the year anyway. They've been beaten, they're tired, they don't have any food. The army ultimately dwindles down to 3,000. So think about that, from 24,000 to 3,000. This army just sort of melts away like the snow. And Washington, as late or as early as November, late November of 1775, is trying to, late November 1776, dates matter. In 1775, he was still in Boston. In 1776, he starts thinking about the need to counteract the news of the loss of Fort Washington. That fell at the end of November. And so with that loss, Washington knew he needed something to change the narrative of this fight, and a counterattack of some kind. He starts looking for opportunities. And that's ultimately what is presented to him with Trenton. The British are essentially, have chased the colonials all the way across the Delaware River, so all of New Jersey almost, and they're going into winter quarters with this extended post throughout the state. Their behavior was terrible in New Jersey. There's plunder, there's rapine, there's destruction of property. You have one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence has abjured his signature and declared loyalty to the crown. It's a huge propaganda challenge. But the militia starts rising in New Jersey. Washington is being fed intelligence about the possibility of an attack, and that leads to the incredible decision to cross the Delaware and turn the tide of the war, which Washington did. In 10 days, he turns the tide of the war and transforms the narrative. Of course, General Mercer dies at the Battle of Princeton. And Mercer is bayoneted to death by troops who might have believed, and we do think there's good sense to believe, that he was General Washington at the time. Mercer is well dressed in a colonial uniform. He's fighting. He refuses to surrender, and he's bayoneted. And of course, most of the other American troops are fairly poorly dressed, pretty bedraggled, ragtag army. And so Mercer would have stood out, in a really grand way, and that made people think that this was possibly Washington that they had. So anyway, that's a good question about whether Mercer could get credit. I don't think you could say it was Mercer's idea alone. There were others. General Cadwalader, who was in Pennsylvania, Washington himself, his staff. I mean, there was a lot of people who were looking for an opportunity.
So sticking with the crossing, Matthew would like to know what type of watercraft did Washington and the Army use to cross the Delaware?
Well, the crossing of the Delaware, we think of it oftentimes with this beautiful painting by Emanuel Leutze from the 1850s, who was a German immigrant who painted this extraordinary history painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You can see it online on our webpage. You can see it on the Met's webpage. And you can imagine it. You remember it. It's Washington crossing the Delaware, where he's standing. Well, I don't remember how he's standing exactly, but he's standing looking forward, and behind him this vista of this massive river clogged with ice, which is much larger than the actual Delaware. And then he's in this boat, of course, which is being rowed by all these different people, some of whom are intended to represent real people, like James Monroe, who was on this, who was in the crossing and got wounded, actually. But also others who are meant to be indicative of the diversity of America. There's a woman in there. There's an African-American member of the Marblehead Regiment. There's a Scotsman by his dress, you can tell. And so Leutze is painting an interesting story about America's greatness in the 1850s, emphasizing immigrants and diversity, and Washington's leadership, and really creating a great historical memory and interpretation, but it's not really what actually happened, right? So the question is about how did Washington actually cross the Delaware? It would have been in very different style boats. Flat boats and what are called Durham boats are often, they're shallow draft boats that were used for carting things along the river, but it actually was a mishmash of lots of different craft. The Americans had been collecting all the craft they could from all over the Delaware River, making sure the British couldn't get them, for one thing, and sort of bringing them together. So it's every kind of craft you can imagine, but mostly these flat cargo boats, essentially, that were used. And so Washington likely would have been seated, in a different fashion. There's a good painting by a Cussler's painting. Is it Cussler, Matt? Nussler? Cussler? Anyway, that you can see online, the Cussler painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which shows what it might have looked like. And again, we have that in our Winter Patriots movie. You can see a representation of that in the snow. But it was a remarkable crossing nonetheless. It took many hours, longer than Washington had hoped. It almost led to disaster, but he had his luck with him that night. Question?
So, Doug, there's a question. Was there ever a time during the war that Washington's life was in grave danger or that he faced maybe being captured?
Was there ever a time during the war where Washington's life was in grave danger? The answer is yes. There were at least three really well documented moments in which people were afraid that Washington was taking risks with his body in the face of enemy gunfire that was not considered to be smart, given that he was the indispensable man, believed to be that. One was in the battles in Manhattan, where he was so upset at the retreat of the Americans that he started basically wanting to assault the lines himself and throw himself into bodily danger there, and was held back and cried, are these the men with which I am to defend America? That's the line that's quoted in the Hamilton musical, in that great song, which in fact is one of the great artistic renderings of the chaos and the intensity of those series of losses, where they're moving rapidly and they're fighting and they're dying and they're actively engaged. The other one is at the Battle of Princeton, is famously where Washington gets within 30 yards of the British line, where Colonel Mahood, who's a very experienced British officer who goes into battle on horseback with his spaniels leaping around him. And he very much in this tradition of gentlemen like showing their nonchalance in the face of enemy fire. That's the British model that Mahood is projecting there. And they're much more disciplined, and they're defeating this Pennsylvania militia under Cadwalader. And Washington comes himself on horseback and rallies the troops. "Rally to me, boys. There are just a few of them, and we will have them presently," or something like that. And there's a story told about how one officer closes his eyes because he can't bear to see Washington being shot dead, which he assumes has to happen because Washington's basically right out there in between the lines who are firing back and forth. But yet ultimately it carries the day. And the other time in the Revolutionary War that I know of, or that I think about, there's perhaps one at Monmouth, but I don't think he's within danger of battle, close arms at that point. But at Yorktown, he also is known for getting up on top of the trenches that are surrounding Yorktown, with his spyglass, observing the battle, and while there's shells landing around him and bullets whizzing through the air, and lots of times officers are asking him to come away, "General, come away," and he will say something like, "You can retire to the back if you like. I feel perfectly fine." That sort of thing as well. So Washington led from the front when it was necessary and put himself out there. Of course, we know famously at the terrible defeat of Braddock in the French and Indian War, he had multiple bullet holes in his coat and through his hat, had a number of horses shot from under him during that battle, but yet was unscratched. So interestingly, George Washington was never wounded throughout his many years of war and conflict.
Okay, Doug, we've got a question multi-part question from William. He'd like to know what happened to General Lee. Was he captured or did he desert to the British? And they also like to know, why did Washington let Arnold live, and why was General Gates even allowed to command?
All right, so these are three questions. I don't know if I can do them all justice, but let's start with the first one, which is a question about Charles Lee. Was he captured or did he desert to the British? Charles Lee is a really interesting figure in American history and not well known today, certainly outside of people who study the American Revolutionary era. He was British, but he was also an adopted Virginian. He was not related to the Virginia Lee family that we think of. He's an English-born man. He serves in the French and Indian War. He also serves in Europe at the court of European princes as a military expert. He probably has a lot more military experience than George Washington, and he has a huge grudge towards the British. He thought he was treated poorly by them. He thought he wasn't promoted properly, and he's also a very eccentric guy. I mean, he's known to also basically have no friends but his dogs. He's got 20 dogs. He's a bachelor, although he has a Native American wife, and he has a Native American name called Boiling Water, to give you some sense of what his personality might be like. Quick to rage, but also probably quite a genius when it came to military affairs. And Washington depends on him, and the Congress love him. John Adams, in particular, thinks that he's very important to the Americans, and they really want him to help Washington because he knows a lot about siege warfare. He knows the European style of fighting, and he's given a high command very early on. He is essential in the defense of Charleston in the early phase of the war when it successfully defeats a British invasion, although they later will be conquered. He also is, again, put in charge of the defense of New York and does what everybody considers to be a pretty capable job with very little resources in a short order. But Charles Lee also has a very different, and I would say revolutionary notion of what the American strategy should be in the war. He thinks it's a waste of time to try to fight the British in a traditional European manner. George Washington always argues that the Americans need to have a proper army that is trained and able to fight in the European way. Partly he sees this as the clear way to contain the British and to fight the British properly, but also it's political. If they have a real army, they can be considered a real country. Like the Europeans will give them that kind of respect. Whereas Charles Lee, very early on, is emphasizing the importance of what we would call today guerrilla warfare, or bringing the war into the countryside, of the army melting away into the mountains and letting the British just sort of alone, and the Americans fighting it out in this way. And also kind of a revolutionary idea about how this should be the Republican way of fighting in a republic. And so Charles Lee is an interesting character. There's a great essay by John Shai, one of the great military historians and historians really of war and society, which contrasts Washington and Charles Lee in their visions for warfare. Anyway, so Charles Lee, in the flight across New Jersey, does a couple of things which are highly questionable. It's clear that he's writing that Washington is not capable of managing this war. Washington has lost New York. Lee is not responding to George Washington's inquiries very aggressively. And ultimately, when Lee finally does start to bring his troops and try to meet up with Washington's troops in New Jersey, he's very careless. He ends up getting himself captured at a crossroads by the British, tries to sneak out of the house, and ultimately ends up as a prisoner of war. Now, there are many historians, and there's much confusion about this, and there's still more to be known. Lee, it looks like, participates basically with the British in helping them while he's captured think about the weaknesses of the American army, what we might consider to be traitorous behavior. Now, this is something that comes to light much later, but Lee ultimately is exchanged, and he's exchanged and comes back into the American Officer Corps in an important role in 1778 when George Washington is trying to figure out a way to take advantage of the British abandonment of Philadelphia. So the British, remember, they took Philadelphia in 1777. They abandoned it after the French come in on the side of the Americans, because now the theater of war has changed. It isn't just these 13 colonies. The British have to think about their West Indian colonies, their Indian possessions, their African posts. They have to think about the world, because the French and them are going to fight on a much bigger scale. And so it's seen as foolish just to hold on to the town of Philadelphia, which doesn't really do much for them. And so that army is going to march from Philadelphia to New York in 1778. And George Washington wants to take advantage of this by harassing, at the very least, harassing that army, at best, finding a perfect location to attack with this now better trained army. Because now he has an army that's been training, at Valley Forge, with General Steuben, etc. And so what happens? So the British are marching back to New York. Charles Lee is put in charge of a big section of the army. Washington wanted to put Lafayette in charge of that wing, but he had pressure to put Lee in that position. And Lee, claimed he could not serve if he was put in a position where he wasn't in command of this, after he had opposed the idea of attacking the British the whole time. So Lee never agreed with that, but then he begs to be in charge of the actual army. And of course, Lee bungles it. when the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse begins to happen, Lee is in charge, and Washington interprets Lee's behavior as being, shall we say, timid and not aggressive enough. That Lee is not pressing an advantage, and Lee is retiring in the face of the enemy when Washington believes he should be holding his ground or assaulting. And so Washington dismisses him on the battlefield, and there's later a very public court-martial. And in that court-martial, Lee's reputation is destroyed, although he's not ultimately convicted. And that's the end of Charles Lee as a significant figure in the American Revolutionary story. So I don't think there's any evidence to say that he goes over to the British. He is captured, but while he's in British hands, I think it is highly questionable what his behavior is. I think he thinks at that moment, which most people did, that the American cause was lost. It's the same moment that Washington's army has dwindled to 3,000 people. It's right before the crossing of the Delaware. So Lee is most likely looking for a escape hatch at that point, and probably later regrets it. Good question. Oh, it was a three-parter, this question. The second one was about, who was it about? Gates?
It's why did Washington allow Arnold to live?
Oh, why did Washington allow Benedict Arnold to live? Well, first off, he didn't capture Benedict Arnold. He would have executed Benedict Arnold if he could have gotten his hands on him. That is probably a thing that kept him up at night and enraged, because Arnold had not only been a trusted commander and one of the great operational battlefield generals in the American Revolution, and a hero to boot, a hero at the in Canada and the Canada campaign, the loss at Valcour Island, but an incredible loss that slows down the British, essential at the Battle of Saratoga, and trusted by George Washington. And somebody, in fact, George Washington wrote to him one of his favorite quotes from Cato after one of Arnold's successes, in which he says, "'Tis not in mortals to command success, but you've done better, Arnold. You've deserved it." I mean, he loved Arnold. He knew Arnold was one of the great generals. Arnold was impatient, and Arnold really disliked the French. And Arnold, of course, ultimately betrays in a hideous way the American cause. Because it's one thing to go over to the British, but he did it in such a way as to try to get George Washington captured, to try to get West Point captured, which was a very important fortress controlling the Hudson. And then not only does he go over to the British, but he becomes a British general and attacks the Chesapeake, attacks Virginia, and attacks it in a devastating manner with these raids. And so Arnold is notorious, and Washington would have liked nothing better than to string him up by the neck as a traitor to America if he could have gotten his hands on him. So that's why he left. That's why he let Arnold live, because he never got him. And of course, Arnold ultimately goes on to live a very despised life in Britain as well.
And so the last question of that is, why was General Gates even allowed a command?
Why was General Gates even allowed a command? Well, I mean, Granny Gates, as he was known by the troops, had his supporters. He had a lot of supporters. He was an eminent figure and had the support of many in Congress. Ultimately has the great success at the Battle of Saratoga. And there were many who thought that Gates would be a better commander-in-chief. Many. I mean, it was a small number who made these sort of rumblings, because people were upset that Washington couldn't win the Battle of Germantown, although a lot of troops considered it a great success, because they'd actually surprised the British and scared them into staying in Philadelphia. Of course, but that was after the great victory of Saratoga. So Washington's achievements by the untrained eye look diminished in the face of Gates. And Gates, Washington is pressured to put Gates in command, and he ultimately puts him in charge of the Southern Army. And Gates makes a complete hash of it. I think there's some statement about Gates after the loss of the Battle of Cowpens, I believe. Is it Cowpens? Or anyway, it's a battle in the Guilford Courthouse. It's a battle in the South, and Gates loses, and he basically doesn't stop for 100 miles in his retreat. And so someone mentions, the only thing Gates won in the South was a horse race or something like that. Anyway, so Nathaniel Greene is put in place, and we know how that goes. Greene famously would lose all the time, but as he said, we get lost, we regroup, and we fight again. and he understood that the British army was disintegrating and they couldn't replace their army. So any costly victory was as good as a defeat to Cornwallis in that campaign. So why he put Gates in charge? Because there was political pressure for Gates to be in charge. But once Gates showed that he was incompetent, he never again would have an important command. So those are three very good questions, and yeah, so let's get another.
So Joy would like to know, were Washington and Hamilton as close as they were in the musical?
Joy asked a question about how close were Washington and Hamilton. Were they as close as they were in the musical? The musical is wonderful. I love the musical. It's a beautiful piece of art, but it is Shakespeare history, right? It's like Shakespeare's great history plays. Henry V, the Battle of Agincourt. It captures a lot of the spirit of the story, but it does it in a way that, of course, has to take all kinds of liberties with the actual truth. Now, George Washington's relationship with Alexander Hamilton in the American Revolutionary War has been the subject of great biographies. Chernow's biography, of course, is wonderful. As well as Forrest McDonald's biography before that of Hamilton, which I think is as good on the financial work of Hamilton as anything written about Hamilton. But there's a lot of romance placed upon Hamilton in the Revolutionary War. He was an aide to George Washington. George Washington had 25 aides through the course of the war. He was a very important aide, and Washington recognized his mind and his genius. And Hamilton, of course, had his close group of friends. But he wasn't indispensable to George Washington by any stretch of the imagination. And he isn't responsible for winning the American Revolution, which is what you might think by watching the Hamilton play. And so George Washington's relationship with Hamilton was interesting, and it was testy, clearly, as well, because Washington lost his temper with Hamilton, and Hamilton, being a very prideful man, basically resigned. Washington tried to apologize. Hamilton refused the apology and went back in a huff and left the army. And Hamilton really had to beg Washington to let him back to be a part of the Yorktown campaign. There was no sense of like, I got to have my right-hand man back. That's ridiculous. George Washington was going to win Yorktown whether Hamilton stayed in New York or whether Hamilton was on the dark side of the moon. So that said, Hamilton clearly, has to be recognized as a man of great valor and as a hero of the war, and the fact that he did lead that assault on the redoubt in the Yorktown campaign. He was given that command by Lafayette, not by George Washington. Lafayette commanded the American army of that wing. The thing to remember about Lafayette, sometimes people forget, and maybe we'll talk about him, but Lafayette was an American officer who happened to be French. He was not a French officer in the employ of King Louis XVI. The French army was led by Rochambeau and had its own officer corps. Lafayette was an American officer, and that's what makes him really unique in the story. Like von Steuben was a German Prussian, but he is an American officer. And then there's the French army, which is over here. So Lafayette's in charge of the American wing at the Battle of Yorktown, and then there's a whole French wing at the Battle of Yorktown as well. And it's Lafayette that gives Hamilton the command, to attack the redoubt in the Battle of Yorktown. So, but clearly Washington's relationship with Hamilton is very close, and he trusts him, and he corresponds with him in the 1780s. But, and ultimately becomes his first Secretary of the Treasury. And I think that it's in that period where you really would say Hamilton and Washington become crucially inseparable in the way that they are working together to assure the success of the American experiment. It's through that cabinet period, I think, and historians tend to project that back onto the American Revolutionary War, in which Hamilton is obviously not in that position of authority and leadership, but is rather a trusted aide to George Washington.
So, Doug, there's time for one more question.
What? Time for one more question? This hour has flown by. I talk too much.
Lucas, age 10, would like to know, how old was General Washington when he resigned his position to start his new phase?
How old was George Washington when he resigned his commission? Thank you, Lucas, for asking this question, because this is one of the really important things to know about George Washington, the soldier, is that George Washington, at the end of the American Revolutionary War, resigned his commission, and went back into civilian life. Throughout the war, he had deferred to civilian authority, although he was given more and more power by the Continental Congress, almost unlimited dictatorial power where the army was ultimately through the war. And there were even some that wanted him to become a king, or imagine there's a possibility that he might become the permanent Lord Protector of the United States, like Oliver Cromwell did at the end of the English Civil War. But George Washington promised to give back his commission at the beginning of the war, and he followed through. The British, after the successful treaty in 1783, finally leave New York in November of 1783, and by December 23rd, 22nd, George Washington has resigned his commission into the hands of the Continental Congress, from which all his authority flowed, completing this incredible act to assure that America would be a government of laws and not a government of men, a republic, not a monarchy, a place that believed in liberty, not a place that would be dictated by a benevolent dictator or a tyranny. Washington is crucial, and this made his worldwide reputation. So the question was, how old was he when he did that? And so it's 1783, so he's born in 1732. So who can do the math? He's 51 years old when he does that. So he's a little over 50. You know, he became the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army when he's 42 years old. So he's a 42-year-old man. He ends up resigning when he's 51. It's really quite extraordinary. There's a lot to know about George Washington, the military leader. It's a crucial part of the story of his evolution as a great leader. It's a crucial part of the story of our American military history as well. And Washington is not infallible, but he is a tremendous political general. He's a great strategic general, ultimately. And I would argue he's not as bad a tactician as many historians like to say. They say things like, well, he wasn't a very good tactician, and they'll point to some blunders at Long Island and Germantown, Brandywine, some issues that can be certainly identified. But in the context of 18th century and the options that he had with his troops at the moment, he's as good as any out there in that mode of fighting, and he beats everybody that the British sent at him. He ultimately wins the war, which, by the way, is how you measure great generalship. It's who wins the last battle, not who wins the first battle. That'll tell you the nature of combat, because there's a lot of luck and a lot of things that people can't control once people start pulling guns out and shooting at each other. And on the strategic level, George Washington understood fundamentally the different phases of that war that they went through. There's different things that the Americans were striving to do before they declared independence. There's different things that they were doing in between declaring independence and when the French came in. Once the French came in, he has a different way to think about what is going to happen in the war and what Americans need to do. And after Yorktown, he has a whole different way of thinking about what is his important role. And Washington showed a tremendous flexibility in strategic thinking and the way that it was executed. And that needs to be emphasized. Flexibility in military leadership is as important as any other quality, and Washington had it in spades. And so there's probably no other American general that was as good a political general as him. Eisenhower is probably the closest match, given the theater of war that he had to manage on a much grander scale, but also the political challenges of different nations and alliances and different levels of government, from the local to the state, to the ad hoc, to the national, to the international. George Washington and Eisenhower share that sort of a grand strategy challenge that certainly Washington mastered effectively, and would use that to go on to become the first president of the United States, and certainly the model for presidents for years and years to come. So thank you so much for the time we've spent together today. I look forward to answering more of your questions offline. Keep sending them in. And remember, there's lots of resources on mountvernon.org that you can enjoy. If you're a student at home who are interested in this, you can really go into the rabbit hole, from articles in our digital encyclopedia to maps, to interactive maps, to movies, to the actual primary documents, and also interviews with some of the great historians of this period, much better than I am, who've actually written in depth about it. I think of Stephen Brumwell's great Gentleman Warrior, and I think of the great, now deceased General Palmer, who's you can find some of his work on our webpage as well. Is a fascinating place to look. I would also recommend you like these videos, subscribe to our news feeds, let everybody else know, together we can be inspired by our past and think about the country we want to be as we get through a current crisis we are in today. We can do great things when we work together as Americans, and certainly as as Americans being a good in the world. And I think this is a crisis which we will ultimately tell great stories about the way Americans came together, the way valiant heroes came in and fought this disease in the front lines, our incredible doctors and nurses and medical people, and the folks who are in the grocery stores, who are out there working. Thank you all so much for your work. I look forward to welcoming you back to Mount Vernon on the better side of this. So thanks again. Bye-bye.